Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 1.9 to 1.12, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 1.9, Normality. We were home again, but it was funny and maybe a little sad how we resembled the us that had left. I didn't care to dwell on that for too long. Arum needed a new layer, and I, frankly, needed the normality of working on something. He was no longer small enough to dwell in the alcove above the sanctum, and so I set out hollowing out a den in the tunnels. I dug underneath the gardens. I wanted to keep him near me, so the obvious choice was to build a large dry chamber connecting to the flooded passage that led to my sanctum, while also widening the flooded space beneath the sanctum shaft into the arena. To reach me now, adventurers would have to enter the garden, avoiding pitfalls, lurking vipers, and all-pervading poisonous spore of the mushrooms. Above these gardens lurked the nacre spiders, spinning luminous webs of pearlescent spittle in its base above the ceiling. Only their juveniles hunted in the garden's floor below, while the adults lurked behind carefully camouflaged false ceilings, waiting to haul some unlucky invader into their clutches. But assume for a moment that someone got past these defenders, they would have to descend into a flooded underwater labyrinth, fighting off the tentacled real fish that I created. If they succeeded in finding their way, they would enter into a large drowned antechamber with a shaft to my sanctum directly above them, and hidden from the den attached to the antechamber, waiting to emerge, would be Arum, my guardian. My cave wasn't good enough. I had to make it some modifications, smoothing the walls. I carved them with scenes of the dungeon's short life. Argent staring up at Arum, the serpent coiled around an egg, Isis in his cage, adamant, being shaped from the earth. It felt good. It felt incredibly good, relaxing, to shape the earth to my will, to carve my personality and my mind into the dungeon until it became an extension of myself. These still little touches weren't enough. He would be cut off from the rest of the dungeon, and I wanted to make him happy. I drew from the eternal lamps that we captured from Travelin's cohorts, and made blob of never-ending flame, small and harmless, and enclosed in a lamp made of emerald green salt crystals. With the intense care I shaped even tiny flaws with the crystal salts, giving them the shape of fish, so that when the light shone through, the shadows of the 100 fish were cast against the walls. To house the lamp, I lifted up a stone in the shape of 2 intertwined serpents, holding the crystal bulb between their jaws. In this fixture, I made the salt lamp balance so delicate that the rising heat of the flame within would cause it to slowly rotate. Across the walls of the fish began to swim and circle endlessly, a warmth of the lamp casting glimmering spots of sapphire and emerald amongst them, altogether creating a sparkling grotto of shadows and light. Now I could feel the craftsman's pride. In the deep pool connecting his lair to my sanctum, I seeded dozens of species of fish, lining the earth with a rich layer of algae to feed a thriving food chain with Arum at the top. Finally, I lengthened the pillars that I had previously created in the snake den that was directly above him, causing them to extend down into his chamber. The numerous serpents that lived in the burrows within the pillars could come and hunt from his feeding bowl if they were willing to take the risks. As Arum descended into his new home, the fish scattered around him, a spiral of silver parting around the dark shadows. Insectile limbs gripped the edges of the shore. 100 legs slithered his jaws. Arum carried an egg with incredible care. Gently laying it in the glow lamp, he curled himself around it to sleep. I did nothing to disturb him. God knows he deserved to rest. But I carefully probed the strange formations of matter within him. I still didn't understand what Olin had done, but I recognized, however, grudgingly, that the man had been a genius. Mana curled into intricate spiraling designs around the core that burned like a sun, each rotating circle of characters intermeshed into the next, and the flowing ribbons of smaller glyphs appeared to vanish as the designs turned. At the center of it all glowed a crystal seed, the same one I'd seen fall from the illusionary tree. It reminded me of my own core, in a strange way. The feathered serpent chimera, Arum, the misshapen creation born from the sin of red alchemy and carries a heresy in its heart. A chimera of many different creatures, its golden dragon bloodline still faintly persists. Blessings, name of the treasure guardian, the beast grows constantly by maintaining contact with its horde, steadily absorbing mana. Amount of mana gained increases with horde size. As my attention returned to the garden, I noticed several developments. One was that outside the golden fruit of the mangrove trees had finally drawn attention. Another was that several of the vipers had finally reached a point of evolution. But that I chose to focus on was adamant. He had reached evolution himself. Your creation is undergoing evolution. During this time, mana you give to him will be more effective, and they will be easier to shape. Choose a path. Stone golem, common. Resembling a living statue, these dutiful servants are dull-minded and unbreakable. Greater homunculus, common. Representing a halfway point between artificial being and true life. The greater homunculus is strange, uncommonly ugly, and slightly intelligent. Earth elemental rare. A whirling collection of stone and dirt bound with a spiritual core. An earth elemental embodies the resilience of the world and is almost impossible to kill. Dwarven Eidolon, legend. The protectors and guardians of the Dwarven Kingdom. Eidolons possess a strange and silent intellect that lends itself to stunning works of craftsmanship. Many-handed servant mutant. Absorbed straight from the last foe defeated, gains the ability to create and control endless hands. The choice was tempting. The ability to conjure countless hands combined with Adamant's resilience would be devastating, making him more unkillable and presumably stronger by selecting the Earth Elemental would have him equally well suited to repel invaders. I could sense in him a deep frustration and anger at how little he'd been able to do against the Eyeblight. But we didn't make decisions based on anger, and I would have plenty of creations that were strong, that were tough, that could defend me. How many chances would I have to pick a legendary path? And how many paths of my creations could take would lead towards craftsmanship? I selected Eidolon and watched as the amber light glommed onto adamant, becoming a semi-solid and encasing him in luminescent crystals. In moments he was only visible as a shadow within the glowing cowl of amber. My last duty was to settle matters with Trivelin. He had set my core aside along with everything else that would be taken from Odin's laboratory. The golden staff, the faceted blue golem cores, and an assortment of little trinkets that had somehow vanished into his pockets. Argent held me in her paws as she watched him whittle a tiny stump out of the mushroom roots. As I waited, he reached down and pushed the peg onto the stub of Argent's missing leg, wrapping it around and taking the loose threads of the fungal cilia around her hindquarters to form a harness. Her usual bouncing hobble-hop evened out as she raced around testing her new limb, which settled it for me. I didn't trust him to do anything but seek his own interests, but I appreciated a servant who could pander to me so well. The small, clever touches of kindness towards my minions and the mouth-watering praise of Jules all told me one thing. The two of us could understand each other very well. I would trust him to know how rich I could make him. At my command, Argent lifted me into his hand and sank her teeth into his thumb. Although he let out a swear of protest, I could feel his hand shake with excitement as Argent curled his bleeding fingers around me. The world faded, and the familiar tablet of the stone descended upon our contract. Between Trivelin Arbiter and the Nameless One, this contract shall be sacred. Trivelin shall undertake any task given to him in exchange for fair compensation. Trivelin shall never betray or purposely harm the Nameless One's interests. Trivelin shall receive an attunement of disguise. On the day that Trivelin delivers a phoenix that lays sapphire eggs to the Nameless One, he shall receive an attunement of jewels. Trivelin left the dungeon with a tremor in his hands, fussing with his collar, shell-shocked by his good fortune. The defense between the scavenger or a poacher like him and a true adventure was simple. An adventure had reached the final door of a dungeon and forced the call to grant them an attunement. Everyone had mana inside them, sure enough, and people who spent their lives challenging dungeons accumulated more than most. But they could only harness it with years of careful training in magecraft, unless they received an attunement. With an attunement, your mana would naturally begin to manifest in special talents, known as knacks. that set adventurers head and shoulders above the rest of the world. Hooking his thumbs through his lapels of his jacket, Trevelyan set out into the world. He was poor, filthily shipless, and smelled of sewer, but he wasn't the worst misadventures that he'd stumbled into on a drunk night. No, this was the beginning of good times for Captain Trevelyan. He took his hat off and dusted it clean, setting it back on his balding head. Oh yes, there were good times ahead, and as soon as his knack manifested, he could go on Adventurers Guild and receive their seal. And with one of those, the world was Trevelyan's oyster. End of chapter. Chapter 1.10 Bells and Lies. Colton, City of Bells. The dwarves had built Colton as a gift to the human empire, and they had built it with all the craftsmanship of their race. Aqueducts carried rainwater from the mountains, and a dozen small rivers ran through the city, spanned by ornate bridges. There was nowhere in Colton where the sound of water didn't flow. And they had built 13 bell towers. Nobody knew why. You could ring one every hour on a different bell, and you would still be left with one to spare. Today, as the main bell rung, the atmosphere of the city was bruised and oppressive. Nobody wanted to be caught out in the streets by some imagined monsters. The only thing that moved were rumors, and they flew with a blinding speed. Trevelyan sat in a tavern with his hat tipped over his face, listening to the events of the night blossom into myth. Olenframt had unleashed the monsters on the city. Olenframt had devoured by his own creations. He had tried to revive the dragons, or to create artificial life. He had trafficked with demons and offended the gods. A brief glimpses of a room became distorted into monsters until the poor serpent was reimagined as a 3-headed lion with the body of a scorpion and a centipede. Trevelyan kept his nose down for as long as he could, but he wasn't the silent sort. No, Trevelyan couldn't help but tell a good story, and he had such a good story to tell. And it wasn't harming the dungeon to tell the truth, or at least a little of the truth. After all, people were afraid right now. Fear made every common people very dangerous indeed, and if there was one thing that he could overpower fear, and Trevelyan knew it as well, it was greed. So why not tell a few stories of riches far-off dungeons that had brought to the distant cities? Why not stir the pot a little and get people to see the benefits? "Friends," he began, "somebody get me a drink, and I'll tell you where monsters and gold come from. Dearest friends, would you not believe where I've been, the things I've seen, all the riches underneath our city?" But while common people worried and gossiped over what Olin had unleashed on the city, in the halls of power there was only one matter to discuss. There was no ruling hand in Colton. Olin had left 3 apprentices, and anyone could see the institute could be torn apart between them as they fought for his legacy. The city would no longer be ruled by mages. Avery had arrived at the governor's villa at the break of dawn, but even that was too late. In the hour it had taken her to lace up a corset and an expensively frilly gown, she had lost the lead, and the courtyard outside of the palatial home was crowded already. Minor nobles lunged about in plaquins, carried by golems, or under parasols. They were a high-strung lot, mostly here to seek reassurances that their lifestyles would not be endangered, that they could continue to live as fat ticks sucking the city dry. They weren't contenders for Olin's throne. There were the river folk, half men, half mer, with the pale blue skin and tendrils instead of hair. Their faces sleek and graceful, with barely a ridge where the nose should be. Bright pink girls fluttered on their necks. They rarely ventured into the city, but not a ship came or left without their permission. Their warriors wore fur jackets and pendants of teeth, poised themselves like warriors with hands and hilts of the sword. But Avery knew them. They would never choose to fight here on fair terms. Instead, they would blockade the city with their home territory in the rivers. Standing opposite them were the dwarves, the outcasts left behind when the halls of their homeland closed the doors. They were solid and frugal folk, without much decoration beyond the clan symbols that they braided into their beards. Sufi Halfhand nodded at Avery. She was a simple, blunt-faced girl, but every workshop in the city would stop if she gave the word. They could tear Colton down in days between them, and the governor hadn't even invited them in. Avery had plenty of patience. God knows she had suffered Olin for years, but Olin had let her city run itself. He was too lazy to be iron-fisted ruler. You can't go in now. The governor has important business to decide. The chief of the guard, a man with a leonine beard and a curling chevalier moustache, stood squarely in her way. In his gold-lined armor and white cape, he must have looked quite dashing. She opened her mouth and exhaled a long dart of flame that caught the oiled moustache like a fuse. His whole head ignited, and there took a light. Without bothering to linger as he screamed and thrashed, Avery stormed past the guards, flames wrapping around her body as they reached up to stop her. She threw her great doors open with an inhuman strength. The carpet singed and scorched under her feet, her clothes, in all their expensive lace and frilly, cold to wisps of charcoal. Governor Colton was entertaining Captain Imar, the prince of the city's slavers and Olin's only true successor. The whip-thin pirate was perched on a chair with the black kid-skin boots in the man's desk, a coin dancing between his fingers. And Avery happened to know his knack made a coin good as a knife to him. "Ah, so you finally get you. We were just discussing how—" "I have no time for this." Flame was all she knew now, a human-shaped blot of wavering fire. So when she glared at the pirate with eyes of blazing blue, and he froze. "We have lost Olin, we have lost Morgul, and we're going to lose the bloody city if you leave the Moor and the dwarves sitting outside your door any longer. I'm not afraid of a bunch of cast-offs and river pirates. Are you?" Emma scoffed. "I don't have time for your bravado, Emma. I don't have time for you at all." Shifting his feet from the desk, Emma drew himself up. He cut an imposing figure, with his long jacket and long dark hair, with his scarred, handsome face, stepping as close as he dared to the fire, and the heat swirled around her. He squared up. "Are we going to do this the simple way? A fight for who owns the city?" There was something mad and bloodthirsty in the pirate's eyes. Avery supposed most people would fear the kind of look. All she saw was a rabid dog needing to be put down. I think the Governor Kedlin started, trying to lift his considerable bulk from his seat, but the two snapped in union. "Sit down." He sank back into his overstuffed sedan chair and his defeated sigh. "No, I have no interest in fighting you. Here's my message, and the dwarves and the Moor will hear the same. This bloated wine-sack won't choose who rules Colton. I will. Whoever binds the dungeon first will have my support, and the city." Her hair had lifted into a blazing coils of gold. She turned and departed then, before she could be dragged into petty intrigues, leaving them while her flame still lasted. The Moor stared at her as she paraded past, the guards rushing to stomp out the flaming footprints. Sufi only grimaced in sympathy. Nobody ever listened. She paused before them, letting them take in the spectacle that made her so feared, the legendary achievement of fire. There is a dungeon beneath our city. It is responsible for Olin's death, and it is the greatest hope for Colton's revival. Bind it to your will, and you will have my support. It was only once she was back inside her carriage, a sturdy little thing built from the fireproof timber and embitties, that she could let the flames flicker out. Her dress rained away from her in a fine dust of ash, clinging to her nude form as it disintegrated. Avery sighed as her maidservant handed her a cloak to wrap around herself. "I don't know why I bother getting dressed up. Nobody listens when I'm diplomatic." She paused, and then ended. "Olin did. God, I think I might actually miss him." "He's only listened because he was afraid of you," her maid pointed out. "Yes, he was a coward, one of his better attributes." She stared out the window briefly, taking in the high tower of the Noctis Bell, a monstrosity of black iron that coked with the moment of dusk each day. This would be her city in the end, because whoever ruled in theory, when the world found out that there was a dungeon here, adventurers would come. People who could bring the gods to the knees. People that even the Empire didn't try rule over. Whoever was in charge would merely be one responsible for bowing and scraping to the predators who came to Colton to hunt in the dungeon. There would be one true authority that remained, the Adventurers Guild. And in Colton City, that was her guild. End of chapter. Chapter 1.11 Gleam and Greed. I had leveled, unsurprising considering the sheer amount of death that had happened around me in the last few hours. In fact, I was already halfway to the next level. You have reached 4th level. You may now choose an attunement. On reaching 6th level, you will have the opportunity to attain higher levels than the attunements that you've already chosen. You may choose to receive an additional schema slot, or an expansion to your mana pool, or a Great Wheel's Whim 1. Without hesitation, I sought through the selection of space, and my mind entered when I focused on a notification. Finding and picking out attunement of Gleam for myself. It was a path that I committed to by selecting Gloom, and I had no intention of backing out now. Secondly, I selected the mana pool expansion. It was long overdue, and I was finally starting to regularly run into the limits of my current reserves, thanks to my efforts in building food chains throughout the dungeon. A regular trickle of mana returned to me as I seeded populations, and they bred on their own as they fought and hunted each other. Hundreds of creatures were all fighting tooth and nail to thrive in the world that I'd built. It was fascinating just to watch them, to see chains of vicious little ants overwhelm a toad, or a pitched battle between a viper and a real fish. The snake caught in the fish's clutches and struggling with all of its might to avoid being pulled down into a watery grave. At every given moment, hundreds of these little pictures of life and death were unfolding. Aphids with crystalline bodies clustering on a flower made of glass. Vipers laying in wait, schools of bright silver fish swimming in unison. The steady drip of water from the cavernous ceiling where nacre spiders lurked. I felt proud of the beauty that I had achieved. Gem Heart Dungeon, unnamed, soul fragments 228 out of 400. Mana 7.8 out of 132. Mana per hour plus 0.4. Anima 1, Logos 2, Arcana 2. Blessings, gift of beauty, gift of the sun. Prone to strange and reckless thinking, this aesthetic dungeon has survived numerous deadly situations in its young life and attracted the attention of the gods. But there was still some ugly business to attend to. My jaunt outside the dungeon had consequences. The storms that had shaken my field of ethereal mana had caused several creatures to mutate violently. Most of them were already dead. A few, however, had survived. What made me curious was what they had immediately fled my territory, as if afraid of me. The only one that remained was a mutated Nemosilia, a swollen mushroom twice its normal size with a pinkish color and translucent limbs. It had grown a number of long, prehensile tubes that oozed digestive bile, and it was hungrily spraying anything that moved. It was an interesting hunting strategy, except that the creature died too slowly. By the time the bile killed them, they would have run away already, robbing the carnivorous mushroom of its meal. But more interesting was how it had changed physically. It had begun to warp the mana around it. Usually, when a creature died within my dungeon, it was eaten by me, rendered down into pure mana, and, if it wasn't one of my own creation, fragments of a soul, the actual predator was sustained not by the meat but by the small tithe of mana it took from me. Over time, this would accumulate until the predator reached evolution. Importantly, I couldn't seem to induce evolution simply by pouring mana in myself. Mana donated by me could change the being's shape, but it would slowly grow more and more resistant, taking more and make the many further changes. I had made a rough observations that this was because each creature carried a memory of its original form, in the way that mana flowed within its body. A rat that I made double the size would still be the same mana pathways as when it was small. Evolution, by contrast, carved entirely new pathways, creating a comprehensive change. A mutated mushroom with no pathways at all. In fact, it had no mana at all. It was like a bottomless hole, drinking and drinking the surrounding mana down, but never filling in the least. It was a blight in my dungeon. Unfortunately, neither Argent or Isis could come close to risk a deadly spit. It was on the verge of calling Arum up from his den inside his crystalline chamber when Adamant began to stir. A frozen light that had surrounded him faded away, leaving only a thin haze of the air. Adamant that now stood before me was only 4 feet tall, but undeniably better shape than I had been able to make him. With the full 5 fingers in each hand, his limbs shaped to imitate the presence of muscles and bone structure beneath his skin and ochre clay. There was even a suggestion of a helmet atop his head, a pointed helm with a cross-shaped visor. Stepping forward, he planted his heavy foot down on the troublesome mushroom. With that, I was finally able to turn my attention to more interesting matters. Outside, an encampment had sprung up from the shores of the lake, drawn by the promise of the golden mangrove fruit. The poor, the hungry, they cast their tents and waited in the mud, none of them willing to be the first to go forth. The rumors of the giant spiders and worse had them hesitating. Even from here, they could see the giant curtains spun as silk, hanging from the tree branches and billowing in the wind. As I watched through Argent's eyes, a lone canoe paddled across the lake. The 2 oarsmen each carried swords, but the old man sitting in front was unarmed except for a torch. His flame reflected in the shining flecks across the bobbing surface of the waters. They stopped their boat just short of where the roots of the mangrove trees formed a false shore, and the old man began to chant, drawing symbols in the air. His torch flaring up as the fire turned colors of brilliant blue. Reaching out, he touched the flame to the spiderweb strung between the trees, and they flared up. But the fire spread no further, consuming only the silk without harming the forest itself. The man wove his spellwork into a blaze, drawing golden letters in the air and throwing them into the flames like he was feeding a fire of tinder. The web weavers panicked and retreated deeper into the forest, but the buyers only spread and chased after them. In the open, the fishermen's spiders were not especially deadly combatants. They had the true strength to wrestle fish from the waters in their nets, but they were clumsy and slow, easily fended back by the spears or swords before they could close the distance and grapple. But as I watched, a brave little jumping spider crawled across the highest of branches, scuttling between leaping tongues of flame. It was the other species that I had made to guard the mangrove orchard, a small but fiercely venomous breed. As the mage chanted and all eyes were on the fires slowly eating their way through the dense webs that guarded the precious golden fruit, the little spider leapt down into the boat, and everything went upside down. The little spider landed directly on the oarsman's face, setting the man screaming and stumbling, his back foot kicking against the side of the ship and making it rock dangerously in the water. The claw had spider off his face and hurled it away, but not before it had bitten him twice, once on the hand and once just above the eye. He curled onto his knees in agony, screaming as he clutched the swelling redness of his face. Meanwhile, beneath the boat, the real fish were beginning to swarm. They watched the little craft rock and tilt and saw its weakness. The prey was already in distress. With a huge thump, the largest real fish smashed its head into the ship's side, and as the man aboard grabbed the railings to support themselves, one impact after another, the whole swarm battering the canoe until the sudden lurch flipped it over. 3 splashing, struggling bodies went into the water. The wounded man never came up. The surviving oarsman clutched desperately to the upturned boat, sword ready, lost in the waters below. Real fish tendril winding across his kicking legs, his fingernails scraping over the slippery surface of the boat's underbelly as he was dragged under. The mage was desperately trying to cast a spell as he went down, clawing golden letters from the air as if they were a lifeline. He was pulled under, but turned on his attackers, throwing out a blast of searing light that flared like a drowned star under the lake, forcing the shadows of the real fish back and killing one of them that had seized him. He surfaced again, skinny limbs kicking up water as he paddled for shore. But it was already over. It wasn't long before he went under again, this time for good. I was only upset that they'd all died outside my domain. I was forced to watch from Argent's body, the rat perched atop the great black tree that guarded the breach of my walls, as 3 perfectly good souls were wasted, trying not to be too upset about the loss. I was briefly amused to see a familiar figure slowly paddling through the water. When I'd first created the creature of the orchard, I had also created a lone turtle, imbuing it with mana as a prize for the first predator to crack open its shell. Only the clever creature had survived, apparently. It had nearly twice the size that it had been when I last took notice. Its shell was covered in dull, squared spikes, which told me something rather interesting. Previously, I had only fed mana to creatures with a purpose in mind, shaping their bodies to one end or another. But by placing unshaped mana into a living being, I could cause it to evolve naturally. This was useful because there were still many things that I couldn't do. Most of the freak creatures that I created to sell in the market were short-lived and ill-functioning. The winged serpent lacked the musculature to fly, and the golden fish couldn't do more than sluggishly inch along the bottom of its bowl. Allowing creatures to grow outside of my will, and one way to induce a more diversity in my little world. Speaking of which, I had 2 perfectly good golem cores, and no intention of wasting time in making some new friends for Adamant. End of chapter. Chapter 1.12. A few small stories. Adamant was born of clay and stone. A strange thing was, his memory started before he became a living being, before he was shaped into an imitation of a man. He remembered the cool, the quiet dreams of the earth, and the frantic, hungry seeking for light of the mushrooms that lined his back. He could remember still the feel of the earthworms crawling through the dirt and would become his flesh. He remembered the ring's hammers against the anvils of the red-hot iron, work songs in the dark, the taste of mead, things that he'd never experienced at all. His head felt like a strangely busy place of late. He sat at the edge of the mangrove orchard with his clumsy feet dangling into the water as he mused. Fish came to nibble at his edges. His thoughts were deep and vague. Being made a living was like being struck by lightning. Energy had burned him, moved within him. A flame had tapered inside his chest that pushed him to move as well. With the motion came reason. Why did I move? He asked himself. The answer was, because I was ordered to. It was good enough reason for a golem. But when he dipped his feet into the river and remembered the idle thoughts of the earth, he felt an urge that he couldn't explain. Nobody had ordered him to dream. Slowly, Adamant reached up and pulled one of his fingers off, the dirt flesh crumbling away in his grasp, leaving a stump. He sat down on the dark clay in his lap and splashed some water over it, wetting it, making it malleable. With careful slowness, he molded it into the shape of a tiny golem. "Live," he ordered, and the little golem obeyed. Strix felt a calm before the storm of grief as she lay in bed. Morgul's soul hadn't been answering the call of resurrection. Not this time. The high priests had tried everything to call him back from the beyond, and she still must lay there in his coffin, like a dead man. Exactly like a dead man. When Strix had first been shipwrecked, Morgul had come to see the girl with an unknown continent. While she lay in the infirmary, blinded and scared, he had traded stories of his homeland in the dwarven mountains for stories of hers, listening patiently as she rambled on about the heat of the sun on her skin and the majesty of the great green river that cut the desert in two. She had told him of the beauty of the red and black sands and the green oasis, the fearful moment which waking up to find a pitch-black tomb scarab laying on her face, the places where the sun-drenched Akata pillars and pleasure gardens of white marble. She had told him everything except one thing. In that moment that she had been blinded, she had received her first prophecy. While her ship had tossed in the grip of the vast swirling maelstrom, thunder illuminating the pitch-black veils of the cold rain that came pelting down across the deck. She had seen God's country's great mountain. For a moment an eternal mists had parted and a vision of the holy pinnacles blazed through to meet her gaze. It shone with the clarity of diamonds, the heat of the sun. She had stared until her eyes wept themselves blind, and in the darkness she had known. Some day she would climb that mountain, but she would never return home. One day Morgul hadn't come to the infirmary. In the darkness she had tossed and turned in her bed, barely able to move due to her wounds, afraid. The day had lasted forever. Until he had returned carrying a gift. He had found other survivors, a nest of tiny desert owls nestled into the broken timber of washed ashore, bedraggled and peeping for food. She ran her fingers over the brown feathers. That was the first time that she had seen through the owl's eyes, and the first time that she had seen Morgul's face. And now she wouldn't any more. Throughout the city the news was breaking. A single fixture of the adventurous girl was broken. There would be men drinking to his name tonight, and when the ale ran dry, violence. Strix would not join them. She had a choice to make. She could do the easy thing and blame his killer, forget the dungeon had been acting in self-defense, and that Morgul had acted recklessly, overconfidently, and it would be the simplest thing in the world to lay blame at the dungeon and hate it for taking her friend. But she had received another prophecy that night, brought to her by a white owl, and the city's fate would turn on whether she shared it with the dungeon. There was no easy answers with fate. Blame and hatred twisted the strings and made you see what you wanted to see, instead of what was. Too much love could do the same. All Strix knew was that she missed her friend. Rusk, with so many scars on his broad-muscled back, and the whip couldn't hurt him any more. It couldn't bite through the thickness of the pale scar tissue left by all the punishments of past. It had been arrogant of him to let them see that, to refuse to cry out in fake pain, to hold his head up high in defiance of the fat overseer who sweated and went red in the face as he struck harder and harder, trying furiously to beat a reaction out of Rusk. The orc only snorted and flexed his muscles again against the chains and whipping post. He was the biggest and strongest of any of them, caught in the wilds. He was the last one who wouldn't break. And today, that had cost him. "Damn the pig! Bring out his son," the overseer had spat, throwing down the whip, "and get the strongest man you've got." The scream still echoed in Rusk's head. His son hardly moved now, his blood soaked through the bandages in a guilty red stains, and he shivered. The only sign that he was still alive, cold, even under the blankets they could scrounge up in the filthy tent of slaves. Nothing here was clean. Every thin sheet had been soiled by blood before, and by any other fluid you cared to name. There was a thin dust to the air of the quarry that clung to the insides of the lungs. The boy would cough, now, then, and cough in great racking spasms, squeezing his lungs empty and pushing out thin threads of spittle, grey with grit. Rusk had always believed someday that he would kill his captors, that someday his fellow slaves would remember who they were and rise up. The simple numbers gave them every advantage over their guards. He didn't understand why the rest of them were so afraid to die. But then Rusk had never been afraid for himself. Not in the way he was afraid for his son now. It was a fear he felt gnawing into his belly, a fear that he would not leave him in the same orc that continued to eat away at him. A shaman sighed, sitting beside Rusk. The old pig was only one who warrior respected. There was still a spark of fight behind his eyes, although a slower and more cunning one than Rusk could stomach. "I can tell you're thinking of dying." "Today would be a good day for it," Rusk said. "If you say so. Me, I've heard a dungeon was born in the city, so by my reckoning it's a good day to live." Rusk's ears picked up. Their people came from dungeons, long ago. If they could reach this one, they would have a home again, a chance at life. A hope in mind kindled against the cold fear of his son. I'll go tonight, and plead for it to give us shelter. The shaman clicked his tongue, turning his gaze to the boy shivering beneath the sheets. And Rusk's spirit sank. They'll kill him if they find me missing, he realized. And it won't be, honorable was the word, but it stuck in his throat. It was a funny thing. When he imagined his own death, it was with honor and bravery. It was a story of a hero. When he thought of his son dying, it was just a death. Cold and without any meaning beyond the loss. "Then we'd better send the boy." Reaching into his tattered clothes, the shaman brought out the tiniest shard of crystalline mana, scarcely the size of a fingernail. Rusk's eyes went wide. "Oh, but I've been saving this since my snout was smooth. I almost feel like letting go of an old friend." Crouching over the boy, the shaman breathed on the shard of mana as he cupped it to his hands. It turned to a pale green fire, making the shadows loom like giants against the cloth of the tent, making the wall turn shades of emerald. Lowering his hands, he pressed the flame into the boy's chest. Rusk's son gasped, a clean, clear draw of breath. New flesh crawled over his wounds. Not even a scar was left behind. He'll go tomorrow night, and I'll keep the cards busy. Reaching down, he gripped his son's hand while the boy slept on. His slumbering face was at ease now, his dreams less pained. Before he was captured, Rusk had never suffered the shame of a single wound on his back, but he had fought hundreds of battles until his chest and belly were so thick with scars that human swords and spears could never pierce them. Tomorrow, while his son slept away, he would show them that. Argent flashed away, its claws scraped the ground as she had been. The raccoon owl chimera let loose a high-pitched squeal as she appeared on its back, sinking her teeth into it. Thick fur kept her jaws from biting deep, and the creature thrashed powerfully, but she clung on in between the beating wings until she tasted the salt of its blood. It flung her free, sending her rolling across the ground. She was gone in a flash of light, gone before the almost human raccoon hands could seize a hold of her, gone before the long owl talons could sink into her flesh. The silver light skittered across the ground like a thunderbolt, reforming into argent. She tore into his tail now, ripping long round feathers free, and as it swept its wings out to knock her down, she was gone again, like a ghost. Again and again, she would tear tiny pieces of the beast away. She would claw and scratch, and when it sought retribution, she would be nowhere to be found. Her brothers had already left her behind. Orem had always towered over her, but now she was insignificant compared to him, barely an ant compared to what he'd become. Adamant had transformed into something new and strange. Only she remained as she was. She was always the smallest of them, the weakest, the bravest. She let the owl-coon crow clumsy with rage before she struck. She let it lunge for her, its beak snapping open, its hooting cry echoing through the narrow sewer tunnel. And instead of teleporting inside, she rushed forward to meet the beast. The chimera flinched, surprised, as the claws sank into the pure white feathers of its face, as her weight clung to its head, as her teeth sunk into its eye. The owl-coon let loose a piercing howl and threw her off, and Argent was gone. A lightning bolt weaving down the tunnel, she left a white face stained with red weeping from a hollow socket, the eye taken for the lost leg. She would be back for the rest soon enough, and when she had worn the beast down to nothing, then taken it apart piece by piece, she would be strong enough to follow her brothers. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.